Jake Morrison always thought the hardest thing about space missions was being alone. But standing in the loading dock of Nexus Prime Space Station, watching alien traders walk toward him with a big metal box, he knew he was wrong. The box made soft humming sounds like it was keeping something alive inside. The way the aliens carried it told Jake that whatever was in there was worth a lot of money and could break easily. The main alien spoke through a machine that made his clicking sounds into words Jake could understand. "We give this gift to show friendship between our people. May she help you well." Jake stared at the box. His brain didn't want to think about what the alien just said. She? A Kithra helper, the alien went on, pushing buttons that made the box open like a flower. "Young, smart, and will do whatever you say. This shows how much we value working with humans." Inside the box was a person who made Jake stop breathing for a moment. She looked human at first, tall, graceful, with a face that seemed like a mix of different backgrounds. But her skin glowed softly and changed colors when she breathed. Her eyes were dark like deep space, like they held stars inside. What scared Jake most was the metal collar around her neck. It pulsed with soft lights that matched her heartbeat. Her clothes were plain and made for work, not for looking nice. She stood in a way that showed she had learned to take up as little space as possible. "I'm sorry," Jake said, his voice sounding strange in the recycled air of the dock. "But I can't take a thinking person as a gift. Where I come from, people aren't things you can own." The aliens looked at each other with their big compound eyes, making light patterns Jake couldn't understand. "Commander," one alien said, "the Kithra are not people in our law. They are living tools made to serve. This one has been programmed to work with your kind." Jake looked at the woman in the box. He could see her bright eyes following the conversation with clear intelligence. "Has anyone asked her what she wants?" Jake asked. "Tools do not want, Commander," the alien replied with what might have been amusement. "They work according to their programming. But if it makes you feel better, you can ask her directly. The neural interface makes sure she tells the truth." Jake walked closer to the box, feeling sick about how casually the aliens talked about enslaving someone who was obviously smart. The woman's eyes met his, and he saw something the aliens clearly missed: a spark of consciousness, of hope, of desperate intelligence trapped behind layers of technology. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "This unit is called Lyra, Master," she replied. Her voice had an accent that suggested whatever language she originally spoke, it wasn't standard galactic. "Lyra of the Kithra settlement of Threnody before the conquest." The words "before the conquest" hung in the air like an accusation. Jake noticed that her answer gave more information than his question asked for. This suggested that either her programming wasn't complete or she was finding ways to communicate around it. "Lyra," he repeated, noting how her eyes flickered when he said her name without the formal title. "Do you want to come with me?" The alien delegates started clicking urgently to each other in their own language, but Jake kept watching Lyra's face. He saw her expression go through what looked like surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hope before settling back into the neutral obedience her caller probably demanded. "This unit's wants don't matter, Master," she said. But Jake caught the slight emphasis on the word unit, as if she were quoting rather than describing herself. "This unit exists to serve your needs." "That's not what I asked," Jake pressed, ignoring the increasingly upset sounds from the alien delegation. "I asked what you want." Lyra's glowing eyes widened slightly, and Jake saw her glance toward the aliens before looking back at him. When she spoke, her voice carried a note that made his chest tighten with recognition of barely contained hope. "Master," she said quietly, "will you free me?" The docking bay fell silent except for the humming of life support systems and the soft pulsing of Lyra's collar. Jake stared at her, understanding what her question meant while the aliens began what sounded like urgent discussion in their native language. Commander Morrison, the lead alien's translated voice carried sharp sounds that suggested alarm. "There appears to be a problem with this unit's behavioral programming. We will arrange for immediate replacement." "No," Jake said firmly, his decision becoming clear with sudden certainty. "No replacement. I'll take her as she is." The relief that flickered across Lyra's features was so brief he might have imagined it, but her question echoed in his mind with the weight of a moral challenge he couldn't ignore. The alien delegate seemed pleased that he'd accepted their gift, but Jake was already trying to figure out how he was going to live with himself for participating in slavery, even temporarily. "Excellent," the lead delegate clicked approvingly. "Her documentation includes operating instructions, maintenance requirements, and punishment procedures should she prove defective. We trust she will provide satisfactory service." Jake accepted the data pad they offered, noting legal language that made his stomach turn. According to Vortak law, Lyra was classified as a Class 7 biological tool with the same legal status as a particularly sophisticated piece of equipment. The punishment procedures detailed consequences for malfunction that included memory wiping, neural restructuring, and eventual disposal if rehabilitation proved impossible. "Thank you for your generous gift," Jake said, the words tasting like lies in his mouth. "I'm sure she'll be very helpful." As the Vortak delegation departed, Jake found himself alone in the docking bay with a woman whose question had just changed the entire direction of his life. Lyra remained in the container, apparently waiting for direct orders to move. Her luminous eyes tracked his movements with obvious intelligence despite her collar's constraints. "You can come out of there," Jake said awkwardly. "You don't need permission to move around." Lyra stepped out of the container with fluid grace. Her movement suggested strength and coordination that seemed at odds with her supposed status as property. "Master, what are your requirements for this unit's immediate function?" she asked. Jake winced at the formal phrasing. "First, stop calling me Master. My name is Jake. Second, stop referring to yourself as a unit. You have a name." "Jake," she repeated carefully, as if testing the sound. "Your designation is Jake. This. I am Lyra." "That's better." Jake studied her face, noting the way her expression seemed to shift when she used her own name. "Lyra, I need you to understand something. I didn't want this situation. I don't believe in slavery, and I don't consider you property." Lyra's eyes widened, and Jake caught a glimpse of the intelligence that her collar was apparently designed to suppress. "Jake," she said, "if you do not consider me property, what am I?" Jake looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the collar and the servo programming to the conscious being underneath. Her question about freedom hadn't been casual curiosity. It had been a test, a way of determining whether he might be different from other masters she'd encountered. "You're a person who's been treated as property," he said finally. "And I'm going to figure out how to change that." For the first time since emerging from the container, Lyra smiled. It was a small expression, quickly suppressed, but it transformed her face in ways that made Jake understand why the Vortak kept their slaves collared. Without the technological chains, she would be magnificent. Jake, she said quietly, that may be more difficult than you imagine. Jake looked at the neural collar pulsing around her neck, the documentation detailing her legal status as property, and the vast political implications of challenging a slavery system that spanned multiple star systems. She was right. It would be incredibly difficult. But her question still echoed in his mind, "Will you free me?" And Jake Morrison had never been one to back down from a challenge that mattered. Jake's ship, the Wanderer's Dream, had been designed for long-term solo research missions. But having Lyra aboard transformed the familiar spaces in ways he hadn't anticipated. She moved through the corridors with unconscious grace, her bioluminescent skin casting subtle patterns on the walls that made the ship feel less empty than it had in months. The neural collar, she explained during their second day of travel, contains several functions beyond behavioral control. It translates languages, monitors health, and provides skill downloads for various tasks. But its primary purpose is suppression of what your people might call free will. Jake studied the device around her neck, noting how its pulse patterns seemed to respond to her emotional state. "Can it be removed?" "Not safely," Lyra replied, unconsciously touching the collar with fingertips that seemed to glow more brightly when she was distressed. "The neural interfaces are integrated with my nervous system. Forced removal would likely cause permanent brain damage or death." "What about gradual removal? Some kind of medical procedure?" Lyra's expression carried a mixture of hope and resignation that made Jake's chest ache. Such procedures would require technology and expertise that only exists in Vortex space. They are not inclined to free their property voluntarily. Jake leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. "So you're trapped by the very technology that's supposed to help you." "An elegant solution from the Vortac perspective," Lyra agreed. "The collar ensures compliance while making escape practically impossible. Even if a Kithra somehow reached free space, they would still require their former master's cooperation to achieve actual freedom." "Tell me about your people," Jake said, noting how her skin's luminescence increased when she spoke about personal topics. "What were the Kithra like before the conquest?" Lyra was quiet for a long moment, her eyes taking on the unfocused look that Jake was learning meant she was accessing memories that the collar tried to suppress. "We were biotechnologists," she said finally. "Our civilization was built around the manipulation of living systems rather than mechanical ones. We could shape flesh like your people shape metal, guide evolution like engineers guide construction." "That sounds incredibly advanced." "It was," Lyra replied, her voice carrying notes of pride that the collar couldn't entirely eliminate. "Too advanced for the Vortac's comfort. They viewed our abilities as a threat to the technological supremacy that maintains their power structure." Jake was beginning to understand the larger picture. "So they conquered your people not just for slave labor, but to prevent you from developing technologies that might challenge their dominance." "The conquest was surgical in its precision," Lyra continued, her luminescence dimming as she accessed darker memories. "They targeted our research facilities first, then our educational centers, then our cultural sites. By the time they began taking prisoners, there was little left of Kithra civilization except scattered individuals with fragmented knowledge." "How many of your people are left?" "Unknown. The Vortac scattered us across their territory to prevent communication and coordinated resistance. Most Kithra slaves never encounter others of their kind." Lyra's fingers traced the edge of her collar unconsciously. "I had not spoken my native language in 3 years before meeting you." Jake felt anger building in his chest, a cold fury at the systematic destruction of an entire civilization. What about your family? Do you know what happened to them? Lyra's skin dimmed to barely visible luminescence, and Jake saw her struggle with memories that the caller was actively trying to suppress. My parents were researchers at the Threnody Biotechnical Institute. They were classified as high-priority assets and taken during the first wave of captures. Taken where? I do not know. Lyra's voice carried the kind of controlled pain that suggested she'd been searching for that answer for years. High-priority assets are typically sent to secure facilities where their knowledge can be extracted and utilized. They are rarely seen again. Jake reached out instinctively to offer comfort, then stopped as he realized how such a gesture might be interpreted given their legal relationship. Lyra noticed his hesitation and gave him a look that suggested understanding mixed with sadness. Jake, she said quietly, the caller makes many normal interactions complicated. I am programmed to interpret physical contact as either command or reward, both of which assume I have no autonomy to consent or refuse. So I can't even offer basic human comfort without it being filtered through slavery protocols. The caller's programming is quite thorough, Lyra confirmed. It was designed to make normal relationship development impossible, ensuring that any bond between Kithra and their owners remains fundamentally unequal. Jake stared at her, beginning to understand the full scope of what the Vortac had created. They hadn't just enslaved the Kithra physically, they'd engineered technological barriers that prevented even the possibility of genuine friendship or respect developing between slaves and masters. What happens if I just ignore the caller's programming? He asked. If I treat you like a person regardless of what the technology says? Lyra's eyes widened, her skin brightening with what looked like surprise. I do not know. No one has attempted such an approach in my experience. Well, let's find out, Jake said firmly. Starting now, I'm going to treat you as an equal regardless of what legal documents say about your status. The caller can interpret that however it wants. Jake, Lyra said carefully, such an approach might cause the caller to classify you as a malfunctioning owner. It could initiate automatic correction protocols. What kind of correction protocols? Behavioral modification transmitted through the neural link, pain, memory adjustment, or emergency signal transmission to Vortac authorities for intervention. Jake considered this, weighing the risks against the moral impossibility of continuing to treat a conscious being as property. Lyra, if you could choose, knowing the risks, would you want me to try treating you as an equal? Lyra stared at him for a long moment, her luminescence cycling through patterns that might have indicated complex emotional processing. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of something that sounded like wonder. Jake, she said quietly, yes. Whatever the consequences, I would choose to be treated as a person rather than property. Jake nodded, feeling something shift between them that had nothing to do with ownership or servitude. Then that's what we'll do. And if the caller doesn't like it, we'll figure out how to deal with that problem when it happens. For the first time since he'd met her, Lyra's smile reached her eyes, and Jake saw a glimpse of the person she might have been without technological chains binding her consciousness. The collar pulsed with rapid patterns that suggested it was processing unusual data, but neither of them paid attention to its signals. They had more important things to worry about than the opinions of enslaving technology 3 days into their journey toward human space. Jake woke to the sound of Lyra screaming. He found her in the ship's common area, collapsed on the floor with her back arched in obvious agony. The neural collar around her neck was pulsing with erratic patterns that lit up the darkened room like a malfunctioning strobe light. Her luminescent skin flickered between brilliant white and deep purple in rhythms that suggested her body systems were fighting some kind of internal war. Lyra! Jake dropped to his knees beside her, unsure whether touching her would help or make whatever was happening worse. What's wrong? What can I do? Memories, she gasped between spasms that made her entire body convulse. The collar is losing its grip on suppressed memories. They're coming back all at once. Jake watched helplessly as her skin continued its chaotic light show, understanding that he was witnessing the technological equivalent of psychological torture. How do I help? Tell me what to do. Just stay with me, Lyra managed, her voice distorted by pain but carrying desperate gratitude. Don't let me face this alone. Jake settled beside her, close enough to offer presence without physical contact that might confuse the collar's already struggling systems. I'm here. You're not alone. For the next hour, Jake watched Lyra experience what looked like a complete neurological breakdown as memories that had been artificially suppressed for years suddenly flooded back into her consciousness. She spoke in what he assumed was her native language, words that carried musical qualities unlike anything in human linguistic development. Sometimes she seemed to be reliving conversations, arguing with people who weren't there, explaining scientific concepts to invisible colleagues. The biointegration matrices, she said suddenly in Standard, her eyes focusing on Jake with startling clarity. I remember how they worked. The cellular manipulation protocols, the genetic guidance systems, the symbiotic enhancement procedures. Lyra, what are you talking about? My training, she replied, sitting up with movements that seemed more coordinated than they should have been given her recent distress. I was a doctoral candidate in applied biotechnology before the conquest. The collar has been suppressing not just my memories, but my knowledge, my education, everything that made me who I was. Jake stared at her, seeing intelligence and expertise in her expression that transformed his understanding of who she really was. You're a scientist. I was a scientist, Lyra corrected, then paused as if considering something. I am a scientist. The knowledge is still there, just buried under layers of technological suppression. Is that why the collar was malfunctioning? Because you're recovering suppressed abilities? Lyra nodded, her skin still flickering with residual bioluminescence, but more controlled now. The collar was designed to maintain slaves in a state of limited functionality, enough intelligence to perform tasks, not enough to remember who they used to be. Your refusal to treat me as property has apparently confused its behavioral modification protocols. Jake felt a surge of hope mixed with concern. Is this permanent? Will you be able to access your memories and training normally now? Unknown, Lyra replied, unconsciously touching the collar around her neck. The device is still active and still trying to reassert control. What just happened might be temporary, or it might be the beginning of complete neural liberation. And if it is complete liberation? Lyra's expression grew serious, her luminescence dimming to barely visible levels. Then I become extremely dangerous to the Vortac power structure, and by extension, extremely dangerous to keep around. They will kill me rather than allow a fully functional Kithra biotechnologist to exist in free space. Jake considered this, understanding that helping Lyra recover her identity might be signing both their death warrants. What kind of biotechnology are we talking about? What could you do if the collar stopped working entirely? Lyra was quiet for a moment, apparently accessing recovered memories. Cellular regeneration, genetic modification, biological system integration, symbiotic enhancement of non-Kithra species. She trailed off, her eyes widening as she accessed more complete recollections. Jake, my people weren't just biotechnologists. We were biological engineers on a scale that could reshape entire ecosystems. Reshape ecosystems? How? Imagine being able to modify a planet's atmosphere by engineering symbiotic organisms that live in the soil and process specific gases. Imagine being able to enhance human capabilities not through mechanical augmentation, but through biological integration that becomes part of your genetic structure. Lyra's voice carried growing excitement as she rediscovered the scope of her lost knowledge. My doctoral thesis was on cross-species biological enhancement protocols. Jake felt his understanding of the galactic political situation shift dramatically. The Vortak didn't just conquer your people for slave labor. They eliminated the only civilization that could challenge their technological dominance across the galaxy. Precisely. And now that I'm recovering my knowledge, I represent a direct threat to their continued supremacy. Lyra looked at him with an expression that mixed gratitude with worry. Jake, helping me means making yourself an enemy of one of the most powerful civilizations in known space. Jake thought about this, weighing the personal and political consequences of continuing to support Lyra's recovery against the moral impossibility of allowing her to remain enslaved. What would you need to safely remove the collar? Specialized biotechnological equipment that only exists in a few locations, most of them under Vortak control, Lyra replied. But there might be alternatives. If there are other free Kithra who have preserved some of our knowledge. Other free Kithra? I thought you said your people were scattered. Scattered, not eliminated entirely, Lyra corrected. There were always rumors among the slaves of settlements beyond Vortak space, places where escaped Kithra had established hidden communities. I never knew if such stories were true or just hopeful fantasies. Jake leaned forward, intrigued by this possibility. If these communities exist, they might have the knowledge and equipment to free you. They might, Lyra agreed. But finding them would require traveling to uncharted space, risking everything on stories that might be nothing more than slave folklore. Jake looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the gift he'd been given by alien traders, but a brilliant scientist whose knowledge could change the balance of power in the galaxy if she could be freed from technological chains. Her question from the docking bay echoed in his mind. Will you free me? Lyra, he said quietly, if these communities exist and we could find them, would you want to try? Her luminescent skin brightened to levels he'd never seen before, and her smile carried more hope than he thought possible for someone in her situation. Jake, she said, yes. Whatever the risks to both of us, I would want to try. Jake nodded, feeling his comfortable life as a research pilot dissolving into something far more dangerous and infinitely more important. Then let's go find your people. The neural collar around Lyra's neck pulsed with rapid warning patterns, apparently detecting conversation topics that violated its programming parameters. But for the first time since he'd met her, Jake saw Lyra ignore the device entirely, her recovered sense of self stronger than its technological control. They were committed now, both of them, to a path that would either lead to freedom or destroy them completely. The revelation that Earth's government knew about the Kithra situation came as a shock that made Jake question everything he believed about human moral progress. Sitting in the sterile conference room of Colonial Administration Station Alpha, watching bureaucrats discuss Lyra's legal status with the casual detachment usually reserved for equipment transfers, he felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of his own species. Dr. Morrison, Administrator Walsh said, consulting his tablet without looking at Lyra, who stood silently beside Jake's chair. Your request for political asylum on behalf of this Kithra is appreciated, but legally impossible. She remains the property of the Vortac Consortium under treaties that humanity cannot violate without severe diplomatic consequences. She's a sentient being asking for freedom, Jake replied, struggling to keep his voice level. How is that not grounds for asylum? Because the Vortac do not recognize Kithra sentience under their legal framework, and challenging that classification would undermine trade agreements that supply resources to 47 human colonies, Walsh explained with the tone of someone discussing shipping schedules. Your personal feelings about slavery are irrelevant to the larger political picture. Jake felt Lyra's hand touch his shoulder, a gesture that would have been impossible for her to make weeks ago when the caller's programming prevented unordered physical contact. Her recovery was progressing, but that also made her increasingly valuable to forces that wanted to maintain the status quo. Administrator, Lyra spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice carrying the controlled precision of someone choosing words carefully. May I present information that might affect your assessment? Walsh looked up from his tablet with the expression of someone who just heard a piece of equipment start talking. You're programmed to speak when addressed directly. I am speaking because I choose to speak, Lyra replied calmly. My neural collar has sustained damage that allows autonomous function. I am currently operating under my own volition rather than programmed compliance. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Walsh leaned forward with sudden attention, and Jake noticed security personnel shifting positions to cover the exits. How extensive is this autonomous function? Extensive enough to access my original training and education, Lyra said. I am Dr. Lyra Threnial, former doctoral candidate in applied biotechnology at the Threnody Institute. My research focused on cross-species biological enhancement and ecosystem-level genetic modification. Walsh exchanged glances with his advisors that suggested this information was far more significant than Jake had realized. Dr. Threnial, what is your current assessment of human biological and technological capabilities? Jake watched this exchange with growing alarm, understanding that Lyra was being evaluated not as a refugee seeking freedom, but as a potential intelligence asset. Her knowledge of Kithra biotechnology made her valuable in ways that had nothing to do with moral principles. Human technological development shows promise, but lacks the biological integration that characterized Kithra advances, Lyra replied diplomatically. Your cybernetic augmentation approaches are crude but effective for your current development level. Could human capabilities be enhanced using Kithra biotechnological principles? Jake stood up abruptly, recognizing the direction of this conversation. She's asking for asylum, not offering to become a research subject. Dr. Morrison, please sit down, Walsh said without taking his eyes off Lyra. Dr. Threnial, theoretical question. If you were to collaborate with human researchers, what kind of enhancements might be possible? Lyra glanced at Jake, her expression unreadable. Theoretical collaboration could yield significant advances in longevity, disease resistance, environmental adaptation, and cognitive enhancement. However, such research would require voluntary participation and guaranteed freedom to choose the terms of any scientific partnership. Guaranteed freedom, Walsh repeated, consulting his tablet again. That presents certain legal complexities given your current status. My current status is as a sentient being seeking asylum from slavery, Lyra said firmly. Any other classification is a violation of basic sentient rights principles. Walsh was quiet for several minutes, apparently consulting with advisors through subvocal communication systems. When he finally looked up, his expression had shifted to something that might have been calculated sympathy. Dr. Threeniel, I'm afraid formal asylum is still impossible under current treaty obligations. However, we might be able to arrange a research partnership that would provide you with protected status while you assist human biotechnological development efforts. Protected status as what? Jake demanded. Protected status as a voluntary scientific collaborator with temporary residence permits, Walsh clarified. It's not freedom, but it's better than return to slavery. Jake looked at Lyra, seeing her weigh options that were all variations of continued bondage. Even Earth's offer of protection came with strings attached, making her value dependent on her willingness to share knowledge that had been stolen from her people. Administrator Walsh, Lyra said quietly, I appreciate the offer, but I must decline. I will not purchase my safety by betraying the scientific heritage of my people. The room fell silent except for the humming of air recycling systems. Walsh looked genuinely surprised by her refusal, as if he'd never considered that she might prioritize principles over personal safety. Dr. Threeniel, you should consider your alternatives carefully. We cannot protect you if you leave human space, and the Vortak have already filed claims for your return. Then I will have to find other alternatives, Lyra replied. Thank you for your time. As they left the administrative complex, Jake felt a mixture of admiration and terror at Lyra's decision. She had chosen uncertain freedom over guaranteed safety, a choice that demonstrated the kind of moral courage he was still learning to recognize. Lyra, he said as they made their way back to the Wanderer's Dream, you just turned down protection from the most powerful human government in this sector. Are you sure about this? Jake, she replied, her luminescence dim but steady. Accepting their offer would have made me a different kind of slave. Instead of serving one master, I would have served an entire government, and my knowledge would have been used to create the same kind of technological dependence that the Vortak used to maintain power. Jake considered this as they passed through the station's commercial district, noting how other travelers gave Lyra's caller curious glances that made him want to challenge every person who looked at her as something other than an equal. So what do we do now? Earth won't help. The Vortak want you back, and we're running out of options in civilized space. Then perhaps it's time to try uncivilized space, Lyra said, touching a data pad she'd been carrying since their meeting with Walsh. While you were arguing with the administrator, I was accessing their xenological databases. There are references to uncharted systems beyond the frontier, places where scanner readings have detected artificial structures of unknown origin. Unknown origin could mean anything. Ancient ruins, abandoned colonies, dead civilizations. Or hidden settlements of people who wanted to disappear from galactic politics entirely, Lyra finished. Jake, some of these readings match architectural patterns from pre-conquest Kithra colonies. If my people did establish hidden communities, those would be the places to look. Jake studied the data she showed him, recognizing stellar cartography that pushed the boundaries of explored space. Those systems are months away, assuming we can find them at all. And if we're wrong about what's there, then we'll be lost in space together, Lyra said simply. But if we're right, I might finally have the chance to become who I was meant to be. They reached the Wanderer's Dream to find it under surveillance by what appeared to be colonial security forces. Jake's heart sank as he recognized the signs of a ship being prepared for impoundment or search, the kind of official attention that usually meant someone's freedom was about to disappear into bureaucratic machinery. Dr. Morrison, a security officer, approached them with the kind of professional courtesy that barely disguised threat. We need to inspect your vessel for compliance with alien technology regulations. What alien technology regulations? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Regulations governing the transport of restricted biological assets, the officer replied, his eyes fixing on Lyra's collar. The Vortac Consortium has filed claims regarding stolen property, and we're required to investigate all vessels that might be involved in unauthorized asset transfer. Jake felt rage building in his chest, cold and focused. She's not property. She's a person asking for help. Sir, please step aside while we conduct our inspection, the officer said, already signaling his team to board the ship. Any interference with this investigation will result in criminal charges. Jake watched helplessly as security personnel swarmed over his ship, knowing they were searching for evidence that would justify returning Lyra to slavery. Beside him, she stood with the kind of calm dignity that made her collar seem even more obscene, a technological restraint on someone who radiated intelligence and strength. Jake, she said quietly, when they complete their search, they're going to find legal justification for my return to the Vortac. You cannot stop this through official channels. Then we'll find unofficial channels, Jake replied, his decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. We're leaving tonight. Leaving how? They'll impound the ship. Jake looked around the docking bay, noting emergency procedures, maintenance schedules, and security rotations with the kind of tactical assessment he'd never thought he'd need for escaping his own government. There are always ways to leave if you're willing to abandon everything you can't carry. Jake, helping me escape will make you a fugitive. You'll never be able to return to human space. Then I guess I'm about to become very invested in finding those hidden Kithra settlements, Jake said, meeting her luminous eyes with a certainty that surprised him. Because I'd rather be a fugitive with a clear conscience than a law-abiding citizen who abandoned someone who needed help. For the first time since he'd met her, Lyra reached out and took his hand, a gesture that would have been impossible when her collar was functioning normally, but which now felt like the most natural thing in the universe. Her skin was warm and carried a subtle electric sensation that spoke to the biological capabilities she was slowly recovering. Jake, she said softly, are you certain this is what you want? Once we leave, there may be no path back to the life you knew. Jake looked at her hand in his, thinking about the question she'd asked him in that docking bay on Nexus Prime, will you free me? He'd thought freedom was something he could give her through legal channels and proper procedures. Now he understood that real freedom was something they would have to claim together, regardless of what laws or governments or alien civilizations had to say about it. Lyra, he said quietly, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. The security team was still searching his ship when Jake and Lyra slipped away into the station's maintenance tunnels, carrying nothing but emergency supplies and the determination to find a place in the universe where collar-wearing was a choice rather than a sentence, and where the question of freedom never needed to be asked because the answer was always yes. Behind them, the collar around Lyra's neck pulsed with increasingly frantic patterns as its tracking systems tried to report their location to authorities who were rapidly becoming irrelevant to their future. They were free now, both of them, in the most dangerous and hopeful way possible. The hidden settlement of New Threnody existed in defiance of galactic cartography, tucked into an asteroid belt that conventional sensors read as empty space and gravitational anomalies. Jake had found it using navigation techniques that Lyra had remembered from her recovered knowledge, biological sensor arrays that detected life patterns rather than technological signatures, revealing a thriving community where none should exist. It's beautiful, Jake breathed as their stolen transport approached docking bays that seemed to have been grown rather than built, organic curves that spiraled through asteroid rock like living architecture. It's home, Lyra whispered, her skin brightening to levels he'd never seen as she recognized architectural patterns from her lost childhood. Jake, they actually did it. My people actually created a free settlement. The docking procedures involved biological identification systems that scanned Lyra with gentle light patterns, apparently reading genetic markers that confirmed her identity as Kithra despite the collar around her neck. When the bay doors opened, they were greeted by figures whose luminescent skin created a galaxy of living light in the curved space. Sister, one of the greeters spoke in the musical language Jake had heard Lyra use during her memory episodes. Welcome home to New Threnody. We have been waiting for you. Waiting for me specifically? Lyra replied in the same language, though Jake's translation implant provided rough approximations of their conversation. Waiting for any of our people who might find their way to freedom, the greeter clarified, then switched to standard as he noticed Jake. And welcome to you, human friend. I am Dr. Kaelin Vorix, former professor of biotechnology at the Lysander Institute, currently senior researcher in collar removal procedures. Jake felt hope surge through him as he understood the implications. You can remove neural collars safely? With some difficulty and considerable risk, yes, Dr.